Hi folks, Josh Wolfe with Wolfe Vintage Watches here. Welcome to my shop. In this video, I'll be servicing a Hamilton caliber 666 micro rotor movement from a 1960 Hamilton Thin-o-Matic T-501. Let's get into it. Stick around to the end of the video where I link you to my review of the completed watch. Okay, the first step is naturally removing the case back. On the T-501, it's a snap-on case back. You can see some marring here from previous opening attempts. And there it is, the Buren-based Hamilton caliber 666. I loosen the setting lever to remove the crown and stem. These need to come out before I can pop the movement out. With the movement out of the case, I can take off the thin movement ring. I can just pop the crystal out of the case with my thumbs. Fortunately, nobody used glue to hold this crystal in place. Off with the handset now. Using a bit of plastic to protect the dial in the hands, I can gently pry the entire handset off using hand levers. To remove the dial, I need to loosen the dial feet screws on the side of the main plate. There are usually two of them, which is the case in this caliber. I start the disassembly on the dial side by removing the dial washer and the hour wheel. I take off the minute work cock, which is held in place with two screws. The minute wheel and the setting wheel come off before I take off the setting lever spring. Here I'm taking out the yoke and the yoke spring. Disappointing many of you, I didn't fling the yoke across my bench this time. Fear not though, I make a pretty serious goof near the end of this service to make up for it. The winding pinion, clutch wheel, and canyon pinion are removed. Flipping the movement over, I can start on a watchmaker's side disassembly. I start with fully loosening the setting lever screw and grabbing the setting lever that falls off on the dial side. Now I can work on partially disassembling what the Buren datasheet calls the automatic device, starting with the micro rotor. It's secured with a screw that closes the clamp of the oscillating weight onto the oscillating weight axle. This is the upper bridge for the automatic device. There are two pivot holes for the components under it. Now I can grab the reduction gear, followed by the driving gear for the ratchet wheel. Here I'm removing the crown wheel bridge complete. As the name suggests, this is a complete subassembly that won't be disassembled further. I can fumble around with the crown wheel before I get a hold of the crown wheel ring. The ratchet wheel screw is loosened and removed. And then out go the click screw and the click. The ratchet wheel in this caliber is made up of two components, an upper and lower ratchet wheel. Can you guess which is which? Now I can loosen the screws for the two bridges. First I'll remove the barrel bridge. There are little grooves where a screwdriver can be inserted between the main plate and the bridge to pry it loose. I'll get into excruciating detail about the click spring later, but there is a quick shot of the click spring that is seated under the barrel bridge. I nab the setting lever screw before I forget about it, and then gently pry the train wheel bridge up. It's a little difficult to see, but there is a generous amount of grease that has found its way under the train wheel bridge. This wheel is called the double third wheel and pinion. The fourth wheel is now removed, followed by the escape wheel. To remove the barrel, I need to now remove the lower bridge for the automatic device. With that out of the way, I can get to the barrel. Now I can remove the sweep second pinion, which is held in position by the sweep second wheel bearing plate. To remove the top balance jewel setting, I need to open the Inca block shock. Using the sharpest pair of tweezers in my arsenal, I slip the ends of the brass shock out from under their grooves. Gently lifting the shock up, I can pick out the jewel setting for cleaning. And to prevent any damage to the shock, I make sure to close it back up. That done, I can now remove the balance cock and balance. I like to clean these parts separately from the rest of the components. The hairspring is incredibly delicate and is easily fouled, so I like to give it a little extra love and attention. With the balance out of the way, I can now remove the pallet cock. And now I can grab the pallet fork itself. Next up is the center wheel cock. This component holds the center wheel in position. Speaking of the center wheel, there it goes. Alright, now I can turn my attention to disassembling the rest of the automatic device. Here I'm removing the upper bridge for the oscillating weight. This component protects and holds all the rest of the automatic wheels in position. Well, that's not supposed to happen. Because of the over-lubrication this watch has suffered, the oscillating weight axle is stuck inside the bridge. Ordinarily, the axle will stay on the main plate. You can even see the excess grease on the underside of the upper bridge here. I love the name of this part, the winding up wheel. This is the dryly named connecting wheel for auxiliary reverser. The wigwag pinion here is now my favorite part name. And finally, I can remove the stop click. With the main plate stripped, I can remove the mainspring from the barrel by pushing the arbor against a steel block. This will pop the barrel cap free, which I can grab with my tweezers. The arbor has worked its way free from the mainspring, so it's just a matter of grabbing it with my tweezers to remove. To remove the mainspring from the barrel, I can walk it out using my thumbs. It's important not to let the mainspring shoot out of the barrel uncontrollably. Not only can it damage the mainspring, but it can also send the barrel flying. And depending on where other disassembled parts of the watch are, it could slam into them, turning an enjoyable day at the bench into a frustrating one, crawling around on the floor with a flashlight and a magnet. Two things make this mainspring setup interesting. I'll talk about one of them during reassembly, but the other is that this mainspring uses a detached bridle. You can see the detached bridle and the hook at the end of the mainspring that it sits in here. Alright, on to reassembly. As luck would have it, I start with rewinding the mainspring. I use vintage mainspring winders which work great. There's a small barb or hook on the winder that grabs onto the hole in the end of the mainspring. The only issue is this hook only works in one direction. This is just fine for 99% of the watches that I work on, but every once in a while, there will be a mainspring that needs to be wound in the opposite direction. Which brings me to the second interesting thing about this mainspring setup. It needs to be wound in the opposite direction, and I only have one set of mainspring winders. After getting the detached bridle seated into the hook at the end of the mainspring and finish winding it up, rather than inserting the mainspring directly back into the barrel, I'll transfer it into another winding handle. This will reverse the mainspring into the correct orientation. Before pushing the mainspring into the barrel, I'll lubricate the barrel walls with a little braking grease. This prevents wear and tear when the bridle slips along as it surpasses a full wind. And after all that mainspring drama, I can finally get it back into the barrel. I don't know if it's just my attitude, but winding mainsprings is easily my least favorite part of servicing a watch. But now I can lubricate and install the barrel arbor. This arbor didn't go in so easily. I mean, why should it? I've dealt with a backwards mainspring and a fiddly detached bridle. Why would the arbor go into place quietly? The top of the arbor gets a little oil before I refit the barrel cap. I fully seat the barrel cap using the flat part of my tweezers, mercifully bringing the mainspring installation procedure to a successful conclusion. It will be smooth sailing from here on out. That is foreshadowing. Back goes the center wheel and the center wheel cock. There are a couple of alignment pins on the bottom of the center wheel cock that need to line up with their respective holes in the main plate. Then it takes a fair amount of pressure to get it fully seated before it's secured with a single screw. The pivot gets a little lubrication before reinstalling the sweep second wheel bearing plate. Next in is the winding up wheel, followed by there it is, the wigwag pinion. I'm not making that name up, by the way. See? Now for boring old connecting wheel for auxiliary reverser. The stop click allows the winding up wheel to ratchet by allowing it to only turn in one direction. It performs the same function as the click does against the ratchet wheel. The spring on the stop click needs to route through these pins so that it will engage securely with the teeth of the winding up wheel. Now the oscillating weight axle can go in. Holding all these parts in place, the upper bridge for the oscillating weight can be reinstalled. This component has a jeweled bearing for the oscillating weight axle, pivot holes for the winding up wheel and connecting wheel, as well as holes for the 3 alignment posts. It's not nearly as difficult to refit as the train wheel bridge is, but it still does take some maneuvering. Before screwing down the screws, I test for free movement and that the stop click is ratcheting properly against the winding up wheel. 3 screws secure the upper oscillating weight bridge. I can lubricate the pivots of the winding up wheel and connecting wheel. Now for wheels that you're probably more familiar with. The escape wheel and the 4th wheel are seated into their pivot holes. The double 3rd wheel and pinion is installed. I'll try to focus more on this wheel in a future video, but there are actually 2 wheels that move independently of each other. Here I'm lubricating the sweep 2nd pinion before installing it through the center wheel. That pesky setting lever screw is installed before I get the train wheel bridge in place. This is probably the most dangerous part of reassembly in terms of the chance of breaking the fragile wheel pivots. All 4 of the wheel pivots need to line up with their pivot holes, which can take patience. If I rush and press the train wheel bridge too hard, the tiny pivots don't stand a chance. I take my time, testing for movement along the way, and work each wheel into place. Once all 4 train wheels are seated, then I can secure the train wheel bridge with 2 screws. Some lubrication for the bottom barrel hole, and the barrel can be reinstalled. Before I get the barrel bridge refitted, I'll install the lower bridge for the automatic device. This part has the bottom pivot that the driving gear for the ratchet wheel sits in. On goes the barrel bridge with the click spring installed on the underside. You can just see it poking out near the top of the bridge. Lubrication for the top barrel hole, and then I can secure the bridge with a screw. The lower ratchet wheel has a round arbor hole. This wheel only turns when the watch is being automatically wound. The click rides above the lower ratchet wheel and only engages with the upper ratchet wheel once that is installed. So after I get the click installed, I'll pull it out of the way so I continue with the reassembly. The upper ratchet wheel has a square arbor hole that needs to line up with the barrel arbor. There is a spring on the underside of the wheel that engages with index holes in the lower ratchet wheel. This is how power is transferred from the automatic device to the lower ratchet wheel, to the upper ratchet wheel, and to the arbor. The crown wheel ring is installed, followed by the crown wheel. The crown wheel bridge complete transfers power from the crown wheel to the upper ratchet wheel only when the watch is being hand wound. When the watch is being wound automatically, the wheels in the crown wheel bridge disengage with the upper ratchet wheel, allowing the automatic device to wind the watch. The crown wheel is secured with a reverse threaded screw, and the crown wheel bridge is secured with a regular old normal one. The driving gear for the ratchet wheel only engages with the lower ratchet wheel. Because the crown wheel only acts on the upper ratchet wheel, hand winding will not send power back into the automatic device. The reduction gear adjusts the torque created by the other components of the automatic device. This is how a relatively small oscillating weight can generate enough rotational power to wind up a relatively strong mainspring, much like a granny gear in a truck. The upper bridge for the automatic device has pivot holes that position the driving gear and reduction wheel. It is secured with 2 screws. A touch of lubrication for the 2 pivot holes. I can now push the click into position. You can see here how it only engages with the upper ratchet wheel. Time to finish with the escapement. Here I'm installing the pallet fork. I line up the pivot with the pivot holes as well as make sure the arm is between the banking pins. Once that's done, I can install the pivot cock. Like the train wheel bridge, this is a procedure that has a higher risk of bending or more likely breaking a pivot. I make sure the pivots are in their respective holes through a lot of adjusting and testing for free movement before I screw it down. Now I add a little wind into the mainspring to make sure that the power is making its way through the entire train of wheels and that the pallet is indexing correctly. With that sorted, I lubricate the exit pallet stone. Okay, now for my very favorite part, reinstalling the balance assembly. Working the balance wheel into place, making sure the impulse jewel is on the correct side of the pallet fork, we should see the watch spring back to life if I've done everything correctly up to this point. Uh-oh. How about a shake or two? Maybe it's just not seated properly, and a little more nudging here and there will get it going. Well, phooey. To be honest, I turned the camera off at this point and spent several minutes trying to figure out where I went wrong. I started to get a little frustrated with myself, so I thought it best to just move on and see if maybe getting the top jewel setting reinstalled would help. After cleaning and lubricating the jewel setting, I reinstalled it into the balance cock. I close up the shock and I didn't know it, but I am so close to ruining the balance staff right now. Again, I turn off the camera at this point because things just aren't going my way. After taking a break, I came back and took the balance assembly off to start backtracking. I found that I hadn't seated the darn pallet cock completely, and it was just high enough to touch the balance wheel, preventing it from swinging. I reinstall the balance, and with a sense of relief more than the normal feeling of joy, the balance thankfully springs back to life. And then stops. And then no. Yes. No. Yes. Yes. Cripes, my heart can't take much more of this. I'm going to get this balance cock tightened down before anything else happens, because nothing else can possibly go wrong this close to the finish line. That's more foreshadowing. Using my auto oilers, I lubricate the pivots. I flip the movement over so I can remove and lubricate the bottom balance jewel setting. Just as with the top jewel setting, I remove it from the shock, add a very small amount of oil to the end stone, reinstall it back into the movement, and close the shock back up. Still on the dial side, I go ahead and lubricate all the pivots. Now that everything is lubricated, let's get an initial adjustment. It doesn't take much movement of the regulator to have a big effect on the timing of the watch. You can see the tiny adjustments I'm making here. And the time grapher says, okay, looking real good, especially for an initial adjustment. I'll take care of that plus 5 or 6 seconds a day, but I'm real happy about the amplitude and the beat error numbers. Time to get the crown jewel of the automatic device refitted, the oscillating weight. I get the screw started back into the weight before pushing it into place on the axle. Then I can finish screwing the screw down to clamp the rotor securely. Here you can see how the automatic device winds the watch regardless of which way the micro rotor is spinning. You can also see how the driving gear is turning only the bottom ratchet wheel. Alright, now I can finish the dial side. I start with lubricating the center wheel pinion with some grease. I then press on the canyon pinion. Here I'm lubricating the pivots for the wheels in the automatic device. I add a small amount of grease to the winding pinion and clutch wheel. This grease is designed for high pressure parts and it doesn't take much to do its job. As we saw earlier, any extra lubrication migrates away from where it needs to be to places where it absolutely does not belong. To fit the setting lever, I first put it in place on the setting lever screw, then hold it with my finger. I flip the movement over and just get the screw started. I need to leave the setting lever loose so I can install the stem later. Now the winding pinion and the clutch wheel are installed. Before I put the crown and stem back into the watch, I lubricate all 4 sides of the stem with grease. I also make sure there is grease where the stem interacts with the setting lever, as well as the tip where it will sit inside the main plate. Using my tweezers to hold the clutch in place, I coax the stem back into the watch. That done, I can screw the setting lever all the way in, securing the stem. More grease for the keyless works, and by more, I mean a very tiny amount. The yoke is what pushes the clutch wheel into position depending on the position of the crown. It will push the clutch wheel to engage with the setting wheel when time setting, and will push it into the winding pinion when hand winding. Another spot or two of grease where there is metal parts moving against metal parts. The yoke spring provides pressure against the yoke. This is what actually provides the energy to push the yoke to push the clutch wheel against the winding pinion when hand winding. I like to lubricate between the yoke and the yoke spring as well. And of course, I always clean up after myself. Just ask my wife. I use a heavier oil for the setting wheel and minute wheel posts. The setting lever spring protects the keyless works components and keeps them in place, as well as creates the two indices or positions of the crown. I'm lubricating the two grooves that the setting lever interacts with here. These are what hold the stem in the hand winding or time setting positions. A little more cleanup of excess grease. The setting wheel transfers motion from the clutch wheel to the minute wheel when setting the time. The minute wheel turns the hour wheel, but when setting the time, it also turns the canning pinion. It's turned by the canning pinion when keeping time. The minute work cock keeps the minute wheel in place while still allowing it to move freely. This is a good view of how motion is transferred from the crown and stem to the clutch wheel, to the setting wheel, to the minute wheel, to the canning pinion when setting the time. Remember all that subtle foreshadowing earlier about smooth sailing? Well, here's the big goof. As I was rotating the watch around looking for the dial feet screws, the click spring snagged on one of my finger cots and bent. Bent real good. I guess I'm lucky it didn't break completely, but man, what a boneheaded mistake to make, especially this close to having the service complete. I'll need to remove the click spring to see if I can bend it back into shape. In order to do that, I'll need to remove the entire barrel bridge. And in order to do that, I'll need to remove the upper automatic device bridge, the reduction gear, let the mainspring down, remove the driving gear for the ratchet wheel, take off both ratchet wheels, and then remove the click. Only then can I take the barrel bridge off to get at the dang click spring. Let's zip through all this. Okay, here we are, the underside of the barrel bridge. I loosen the screw that secures the click spring and take it out. In addition to bending the spring out, I also bend it up a little. Using a completely flat steel block, I can hopefully fix both issues. Using the tip of my tweezers, I can close the angle of the spring a little and see how I did by refitting it back into place. A couple of things to keep in mind when manipulating springs. One, there are springs and like to spring. Keeping a good grip on them is a balancing act. Second, I want to try to bend the metal as little as possible. Too much back and forth and the metal can weaken and break. You can see here how the click spring pokes out from the barrel bridge. I'm happy I fixed it. I'm disgruntled I had to fix it. Alright, back on track. Although, since we've already seen this reassembly once during the video, what do you say we speed things up and never speak of it again? Sound good? Good. As I was saying, to get the dial reinstalled, I need to loosen the dial feet screws. Then I can install the final two internal parts of the watch, the hour wheel and the dial washer. The dial is lined up with the movement and the dial feet with their holes. Sometimes it takes a little more pressure than others to get the dial seated, but in this case the dial fell right into place. Flipping the whole thing over, gravity will pull the movement down enough to hold it steady as I tighten the dial feet screws. For some odd reason, I was very aware of where the click spring was at all times while doing this. Time-only watches are a snap to reinstall the handset. I first get the hour hand pressed onto the hour wheel. Then I can just line it up perfectly with the 12 o'clock marker, which of course my crack cinematographer missed. Then I can line up the minute hand with the hour hand and 12 o'clock marker. I use these handheld hand pressing tools to press everything into place. I check for clearance between the hour and minute hands as well as between the minute hands and the raised numerals and markers. Once that all looks good, I can push the sweep second hand onto the extended pivot of the sweep second pinion, again checking for clearance between all of the hands. To compress the crystal to reinstall it into the case, I use a crystal lift. This nifty tool uses several brass claws to uniformly compress the entire circumference of the crystal enough to fit inside the case. I have links to nearly all of the specific tools I use in the description below if you want to check them out. The crystal can now be refitted back into the case. When I loosen the crystal lift, the acrylic expands back to size and presses itself firmly against the sides of the case. This crystal was in excellent shape, but all acrylic crystals can benefit from a quick polish with some polywatch. Time to case this little devil up. You didn't think I'd go the whole video without making a dad joke about this caliber, did you? Removing the crown and stem, I carefully set the dial of movement back into place. I need to be careful that I don't drop it or set it in sideways, which could scratch the inside of the crystal. I refit the crown and stem to align the movement to the case and tighten the setting lever screw back down. The movement ring will hold the movement steady inside the case once the snap-on case back is snapped back on. Now that the watch is reassembled and lubricated, I'll give it another regulation and see how things look. I'll take 0 seconds per day. Here's an interesting finding. This caseback has a notch that is supposed to go over the stem, but there are marks on both sides where the micro rotor had been dragging. This means two things. One, the micro rotor was dragging, which would have sounded horrible in addition to degrading the effectiveness of the automatic device. And two, somebody installed the caseback backwards. At this point, it really doesn't matter. I've corrected any mistakes or oversights made by others, and any I may have made along the way as well. Click the playlist on the left to check out other service and restoration videos of mine. To see my review of the completed 1960 Hamilton T-501, check out the video on the right. Please remember to subscribe, like, and share, and leave your comments and questions below. As always, thank you very much for watching. See you next time. Bye.